Hey everybody, my name is Dr. Scott Giacomucci. I am a trauma therapist and trauma educator, and I'm also a person in long-term recovery. Today, I want to talk a bit about integrating trauma-informed principles into 12-step programs. So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the connection between trauma and addiction, tiny bit about the history of 12-step programs as it relates to the history of PTSD and trauma. I'm going to talk a bit about the 6 trauma-informed principles, and then I'm going to offer a handful of suggestions for how we can further integrate trauma-informed principles into 12-step programs. During this video, I'm going to be both critiquing some of the norms in 12-step programs while also celebrating some of the things that 12-step programs implicitly do that really embody 12-step principles already. So in thinking about 12-step programs, the first of the 12-step programs, of course, was Alcoholics Anonymous, which was founded in 1935. So we're going back nearly about 90 years at this point. So although the 12-step programs don't typically mention trauma very often, it's interesting to note that some of the newer 12-step programs, such as ACA, tend to mention trauma a lot more, whereas the older 12-step programs, such as AA, don't seem to mention trauma much at all. And I think this makes sense because of the history and evolution of post-traumatic stress disorder and our understanding of trauma within psychology and within the society, that post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't named as a diagnosis until 1980. So that's 45 years after AA and the 12 steps were created. So it makes sense that trauma and PTSD aren't really talked about in the big book. I'm pretty convinced that if Bill W. and Dr. Bob were alive today and wrote the big book today, that they would be talking quite a bit about trauma. Of course, Bill W. was a veteran and Dr. Bob was a doctor. So if they both were alive today and were creating Alcoholics Anonymous today, they would have certainly been aware of, and probably intimately aware of, post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma, and they would have had the language to talk about this and articulate it. I'm pretty convinced that the language they use around spiritual malady and underlying problems that fuel our drinking, that what they're really talking about is the phenomenon of trauma, of traumatic stress. They just didn't have words to name that at the time. So in the context of 12-step programs and understanding trauma, one of the most important things that we want to work towards is creating safe and supportive environments. And this is something that I really feel like 12-step programs already do a pretty good job with, better than most programs that have a history like theirs. Of course, there's ways that they can grow, and there's communities that they could do a much better job of including. In understanding trauma as it relates to addiction, we really need to consider the cyclical cycle that the two of them are in. That for most people, trauma, adversity, loss tends to fuel substance use and drinking. Not for everybody, but for most people. Based on my experience and based on the research, I would say 9 out of 10, 8 out of 10 at least, that earlier adversity tends to fuel substance use or drinking. And then, of course, the drinking and drugging leads to more trauma, more adversity, more loss, more relationship problems, which just fuels more drinking and drugging. There's also a really strong connection between relapse and unresolved trauma and loss. There's an inpatient addiction program that I've been working at for nearly 15 years at this point. And one of the things that we noticed there when we created a program specifically for relapse prevention, and in order to be accepted into that program, you had to have a history of sobriety and a history of recovery followed by some sort of relapse. And over time, we realized that every single person that was in that program that had recovery time in the past and relapsed was someone that also had unresolved trauma and loss that wasn't being addressed. And so there seems to be a really strong connection between relapse and unresolved trauma and loss. So in many ways, trauma therapy and trauma recovery are a effective form of relapse prevention. Now, the one other consideration we need to consider in terms of trauma-informed principles in 12-step programs is the risks of retraumatization. So retraumatization is one of the primary reasons why SAMHSA created trauma-informed care. It was based on the realization that many programs and treatment centers that were trying to help people were unknowingly causing harm. And retraumatization is more than just harm, but it's when there's a harm, a here and now harm, that also triggers and activates a past trauma at the same time. And you have this kind of combination of being triggered and experiencing new harm at the same time. And many of the 12-step programs have been critiqued for potentially re-traumatizing clients. And I think you tend to see this the most in the relational reenactments that happen in meetings, where people will put down alcohol or drugs and let go of this significant relationship in their life. And then all of a sudden they jump into an unhealthy relationship with somebody else in their life and develop a different form of dependency on a person instead of on the substance or the alcohol. And it leads to all sorts of abuses and neglect and abandonment and loss and conflict. Also see re-traumatization take place in the form of rejection or stigma or shame, in that some of the norms within 12-step programs are pretty old school and not entirely inclusive for everybody. And the third common area that I see re-traumatization take place is in the abuse of power from sponsors. So the sponsor is basically like a mentor within a 12-step program, somebody who you can reach out to and call upon for support and guidance and to listen to you, and someone whose primary job is to take you through the 12 steps. And there's some really incredible sponsors out there that save lives. And there's also some really abusive sponsors out there who haven't done all of their own work or enough of their own work. And the power of being a sponsor gets to their head, and it leads to all sorts of abuses of power and rigidity and shaming and stigmatizing. The fourth area that I see re-traumatization take place in 12-step programs is for folks that have experienced spiritual abuse or religious trauma, in that there's so much emphasis on God and spirituality in the 12 steps and in all the 12-step programs. And of course, the 12-step programs came from a Christian tradition, so it makes sense that there's an emphasis on spirituality, on God. And there's a lot of religious prayers and rituals that are just built into the 12 steps, even though AA and the 12-step programs explicitly say that they are not religious, they're spiritual. There's still a lot of religious prayers that are used. For example, the Our Father is commonly prayed at the end of a meeting. So folks who have experienced religious or spiritual trauma may really be triggered and re-traumatized in the meetings, because there's a real rigidity, not in every meeting, but in many meetings, about the spiritual component of the program. Now, of course, there are agnostic and atheist meetings, which are great and inclusive for folks that may have experienced past trauma related to religion and spirituality. But overall, I think this is an area where 12-step meetings could be a bit better. So as I talk about the different risks of re-traumatization in meetings, I also want to name that it's impossible to be 100% safe and 100% trigger-free and to create that kind of environment. It's just not possible. We're talking about a group of humans coming together, and a group of humans that are coming together to take care of themselves and help other people. So naturally, in any group of humans, there's going to be some shortcomings, and there's going to be some things that are less than optimal. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, and we shouldn't work towards making our 12-step fellowships and meetings as trauma-informed as possible. So there's 6 principles of trauma-informed care, and I'm going to go through them very quickly here. If you wanted to dive into them in more detail, I would encourage you to check out some of the other videos on my YouTube channel here. The first trauma-informed principle is about safety. And so this is the opposite of trauma, safety. That we have to attend to all the different levels of safety: physical safety, emotional safety, social, psychological safety, cultural safety, and ensure that we're not causing harm. The second principle is about trustworthiness and transparency. And there's a real connection. The more transparent we are, the more trust people will offer to us. So this means that we have to operate with integrity. We have to do what we say and say what we do. And I feel like 12-step programs already do a pretty solid job in emphasizing accountability and integrity. The third trauma-informed principle is about peer support. The power of mutual aid, of one person in recovery helping another person in recovery. And this is an area where I feel like the 12-step programs really shine. They do an incredible job of cultivating peer support and mutual aid, again, which is the third trauma-informed principle. Many trauma survivors are going to feel safer with a peer, with someone who's been through something similar to them, than they will with a professional. So again, this third principle is where I feel like 12-step programs really do an excellent job. The fourth principle is about collaboration and mutuality. This is also a principle that I feel like 12-step programs do a pretty good job with. Collaboration, of course, means that we're in this together, and all the 12-step literature explicitly acknowledges that, in that they use the pronouns we and our to really emphasize that we're in this together. And mutuality, meaning that we treat everybody with respect, with dignity, and we treat everybody as equals. I feel like mutuality is really built into some of the traditions and norms within 12-step programs. The emphasis on anonymity really promotes mutuality. So this is one that I feel like can kind of get lost in some of the personalities and then some of the norms that emerge within 12-step programs. The fifth trauma-informed principle is about empowerment, voice, and choice. So this means that we create spaces that are empowering. We encourage people to speak up, to use their voice. We respect and listen to their voice when it's used. And as much as possible, we offer choices. The sixth trauma-informed principles is about identity, and particularly about gender, culture, and history. So this is one of the trauma-informed principles that I feel like 12-step programs could do a better job with. There's like a real emphasis on identifying as an alcoholic, which ties into this sixth trauma-informed principle. I think it might be more empowering to encourage folks to identify as a recovering alcoholic or a person in recovery. Many of the meetings, just based on the norm, they're really cultivating this sense of shared identity within the rooms, which I think is particularly powerful. And one of the reasons why 12-step programs are so effective, in that it's creating a sense of belonging and cohesion. Though I feel like beyond the shared identity of being an alcoholic or whatever it is related to all the different 12-step programs, I feel like there could be a much better job and more attention given to different aspects of identity. Now, of course, there are some gender-specific meetings and young people meetings and LGBTQ plus meetings and meetings for professionals, which is great. But overall, I feel like this is an area where 12-step meetings could do a little bit of a better job with. So again, these are the 6 trauma-informed principles, and I really do feel like 12-step programs do an excellent job embodying these 6 principles already. And there's some specific suggestions that I want to throw out there. As a person that's spent a lot of time in 12-step meetings, and as a therapist that specializes in trauma and provides education on trauma, and works pretty frequently with addiction treatment programs and people in recovery homes and people in 12-step recovery. I also want to highlight that we need to incorporate these principles not just in the program, but also within the culture within 12-step programs. So I see these as distinctly different. The 12-step program, the steps, the literature and all that, I feel like at its core does a pretty good job of implementing these 6 principles, although the language that they use is quite outdated and needs to be updated. The culture within different groups is going to vary because each group is autonomous and makes up their own decisions, their own guidelines, and it's a different group of people each, between group to group. So the group culture is going to emerge differently. The group culture and the personalities within, and particularly in sponsorship relationships, is really where I think the 6 trauma-informed principles could be better integrated and more easily integrated. So here's some of the suggestions that I have, and I've already mentioned a couple of them. One of them is about using more inclusive, less judgmental and stigma-oriented language. A simple shift that a lot of people are already doing is changing their introduction from saying, I'm Scott, I'm an alcoholic, to I'm Scott, I'm a person in recovery, or I'm a person in long-term recovery, or I'm a recovering alcoholic. This is a really simple thing. I think providing flexibility is another helpful suggestion. Oftentimes, there's a real black and white thinking within the rooms and within 12-step programs. Some of that I feel like is really born out of necessity because people are, we're dealing with a life or death situation. And so there definitely needs to be some accountability, some non-negotiables. But beyond issues related to safety, there could certainly be more flexibility integrated into program and into norms. Many groups do this inherently, giving people the option to share or not to share, letting people move at their own pace within the program, within the steps, with support, with encouragement, with nudging, but really providing choice at the same time. An area that I really feel like the program and sponsors could do a better job with is the way that 4th and 5th steps are handled. In the 4th step, of course, we're asked to make a bunch of lists of our resentments, of our fears, of our sex inventory, and of our assets. Sometimes I feel like that assets list gets brushed over or doesn't get paid attention to. A simple thing that could be done is to really emphasize that assets list a bit further. But really, when we get to that resentments list and when we're going over it with a sponsee, we need to be really careful about insisting that the sponsee has a part in childhood trauma that they've experienced. This is an area where I heard many people experiencing harm and retraumatization that they put on their 4th step and share on their 5th step that they were sexually molested or they experienced childhood trauma of some sort. And then the sponsor says, well, what was your part in that? And they're just following the script of the 4th and 5th step, but it's quite insensitive and disempowering and shaming and just not trauma-informed, harmful to insist that a child plays a part in their own sexual trauma. Now, of course, that framework of insisting that we look at our own part in things is important, especially for decisions and resentments that we have in adulthood. But I feel like for resentments from childhood, and particularly resentments related to trauma, abandonment, loss, neglect, abuse, that column asking what was your part in it should be skipped or removed. So this is one simple thing that we can do to make our 4th and 5th steps a bit more trauma informed. Another important thing to do would be to really emphasize the norm, which is already in place. And I love this norm. I actually borrow it in my trauma groups, that we share in a general way about our experience, strength, and hope. In a general way. We don't share war stories and specific gory details of our experiences. When we share those war stories, we really can be triggering people and activating stressful memories. Now, of course, we're not going to entirely avoid triggering everyone at all times. And there's a lot of controversy about trigger warnings. Actually, some of the research suggests that when a trigger warning is provided, it actually makes people more hyper-aroused and activated and creates more post-traumatic stress than when there is no trigger warning. But that's a whole nother story. I want to emphasize this norm to share in a general way, that it's not helpful to be sharing the specific details of war stories, whether they're war stories about drinking and drugging or war stories about trauma. Those are details that should be shared with a sponsor, with a close friend, with a therapist, but not in a meeting. This is where you could really unknowingly trigger folks in the room. And we want to avoid doing that where we can. The next suggestion I have for integrating trauma-informed principles into 12-step culture is in relational dynamics, and particularly in sponsorship relationships. Again, many sponsors are amazing, and they do an incredible job of being aware of their own bias, of their own areas of growth while helping their sponsees. Though other sponsors really struggle to maintain a sense of humility and not let the power of being a sponsor get to their head. So I think attending to relational dynamics in a really thoughtful way and continuing to do our own recovery work is essential for all sponsors. And I feel like there could be a lot more accountability provided for sponsors. Like, many people become a sponsor without receiving any guidance on how to be a sponsor, and they're literally just making new sponsors how to be a sponsor. Of course, ideally, every sponsor has a sponsor, but we know that's not always true. And even sponsors that have a sponsor aren't always using their sponsor and aren't asking their sponsor specific questions on how to be a sponsor for their sponsees. So I feel like there could be a much more structured and a specific framework for teaching people how to sponsor others. And I don't want to say providing accountability, but providing some sort of oversight for sponsors. When I think about my development as a professional supervisor, in one of the certifications I have related to being a trainer and supervisor, I had to do a three-year process of being supervised to be a supervisor and trainer. And I feel like something similar to that, though without the same formality, would be really helpful for sponsors, whether it's workshops on sponsorship or a real explicit acknowledgement in the norms or the literature that when you're sponsoring someone who begins to sponsor others, that your responsibility is to really oversee and provide support for your sponsee who is now also a sponsor. But there's certainly an area of growth here. Another important way of integrating trauma-informed principles into 12-step programs is speaking up when you see someone hurting others, or when you see what we call 13th stepping, when somebody who has been in the program for a while is exploiting newer and vulnerable members. There's a lot of this that goes on in 12-step programs, and from what I can tell, it's one of the primary reasons that people don't come back to 12-step programs. They feel like they were taken advantage of by someone who was supposed to be there to support them, to guide them, someone who had been in the program for multiple years, but ended up acting out sexually or acting out relationally and gaslighting, neglecting, abusing, or exploiting newer group members who are in a vulnerable position, a vulnerable transition in their life. So I think this is something that could be really just integrated right into the norms that are read at the beginning of a group and more directly addressed through the group conscious, through business meetings, to address the specific situations that are emerging at specific meetings. But speaking up when you see someone acting out and hurting others, exploiting others. Some other ways that we could make our meetings more trauma-informed would be to revisit some of the rituals that involve religious prayers, maybe creating or ending with a new ritual that doesn't involve the Our Father, instead maybe having a moment of silence, or some sort of other creative ritual, reading something else from the literature that isn't explicitly Christian or religious. Another important area to reconsider is touch. There's such an emphasis in many meetings on hugs and putting your arm around people's shoulder at the beginning or at the end of the meetings, especially during the prayers. And this is one where I've had many clients who are trauma survivors really be uncomfortable and not go back to meetings. That one of the most common ways that trauma can impact us is it leaves our nervous system really on edge, especially when we've experienced really violent or inappropriate physical touch. That physical touch, and especially unexpected physical touch, is going to make us pretty uncomfortable. It's going to make us feel unsafe. So I feel like there should be some sort of consent process around hugs, around arms around the shoulder, and some sort of equal alternative that's offered. One other suggestion I have for making meetings and the program a bit more trauma-informed would be to consider the language of character defects and shortcomings as almost a synonym for defenses or protective parts. That when we look at a list of all of the character defects and shortcomings, are the most common ones, that most of them are really just defenses. They're strategies, behaviors that we've learned to do over time in order to protect ourselves when we feel anxious, when we feel threatened, or sometimes we use them to protect our drinking when we feel like our drinking is threatened. And this slight shift in perception can really go a long way, in that we stop looking at people as resistant or unable to be honest with themselves, or even just acting out. And we reconsider that through the lens of trauma and defenses, that this person's utilizing behaviors in order to try to manage their anxiety. And from that perspective, we can have more compassion, empathy, and understanding for them, rather than rejecting them or avoiding them even. So in thinking about trauma-informed principles in 12-step programs. I really want to emphasize the importance of education and learning more about trauma-informed principles, trauma-informed care, because it really can be implemented further into 12-step meetings and into 12-step programs in an effective way, and celebrating that 12-step meetings and programs are already implementing trauma-informed principles and doing a pretty good job at it without having the language or the framework already existing when they were created. I think it's important to really emphasize that we refer people out to professional support when it's needed. That this is even explicitly mentioned in the big book, that one of the kind of norms that can emerge in the really old school conservative 12-step programs is that, therapists and professionals are bad. They don't know what they're talking about. You shouldn't take any medications. You shouldn't listen to your doctor or psychiatrist. And these are just misleading and bad advice. Again, we really want to encourage people to seek professional support when they need it. That a 12-step meeting is not therapy. It's not designed to be therapy. It's there to support people in their recovery from addiction. And in talking about trauma-informed meetings, we also have to acknowledge that trauma-informed care and trauma-informed principles are not treatment for trauma and PTSD. They're not a substitute for trauma therapy. And so we want to encourage people to seek therapy, to seek counseling when needed. The other recommendation I want to highlight is the importance of self-care and continuing to do our own work, that none of us have ever made it. We can't rest on our laurels. We have to continue to take inventory. We have to continue to meditate, to continue to grow, to be the best that we can be, to work on our shortcomings, to make amends. And I want to emphasize that if you're in a 12-step group that isn't meeting your needs, that doesn't feel particularly trauma-informed, and you've tried to speak up, you've tried to advocate for yourself, you've gone to the business meeting and offered suggestions, you can always start your own group. There's a fun little motto saying in the meetings in the fellowship that all you need to start a new meeting is a coffee pot and a resentment. And that's how many meetings were started. So if you're developing a resentment and feeling like the meeting that you're attending isn't meeting your needs, you can always start your own group. So again, I hope that you find this video useful and helpful. Of course, this is in part a critique of 12-step programs, and I also want to emphasize this also as a celebration of 12-step programs, that there's some real beautiful things that 12-step programs have done and are doing and have saved and continue to save the lives of countless people. And I want to encourage us to do better and continue to grow, that we, just like as individuals, we can't rest on our laurels. We can't stop taking our own inventories and growing. That as a fellowship and as a program, we need to continue to grow, take our own inventory, and to adapt and modify for the times. So if you found this video useful, I encourage you to rate in the comments about what you found helpful in this video, and check out some of the other videos within this channel if you wanted to learn more about trauma, about the connection between addiction and trauma, and about trauma-informed principles.